Welcome to Cafe Tales. Tonight we journey to the Yorkshire moors in 1929, where Poirot and Captain Hastings encounter a most peculiar mystery. A spiritualist murdered in an antique wardrobe, a medium with blood on her scarf, and supernatural claims hiding a sinister truth. This is The Murder in the Wardrobe, a tale of elaborate deception and calculated murder, told in tribute to Agatha Christie's masterful storytelling. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. If this mystery captures your imagination, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Now settle in with your favorite drink and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Return to Whitehaven. Mansions. The familiar sight of Whitehaven mansions greeted me with a warmth that only comes from returning to one's true home after a prolonged absence. 3 years on the ranch in Argentina had bronzed my skin and broadened my shoulders. But as I climbed the well-worn steps to Poirot's flat, I felt myself settling back into the comfortable rhythms of London life like a well-tailored coat. I paused outside the door, hearing the unmistakable sound of my old friend's morning routine. The precise clink of china, the rustle of the Times, and what sounded suspiciously like humming. A smile tugged at my lips as I raised my hand to knock. "Entree!" came the familiar voice before my knuckles had touched the wood. I stepped inside to find Hercule Poirot seated before his dressing table mirror, carefully applying wax to his magnificent mustaches with the concentration of a master craftsman. His reflection caught my eye in the glass, and those familiar green eyes twinkled with unmistakable pleasure. "Hastings, mon ami, you are punctual to the minute. I have been expecting you since precisely 9:15. "Good Lord, Poirot," I said, settling into my old chair by the fireplace. "Still consulting those little gray cells about arrival times, I see. And still," I added with a grin, "fussing over that facial hair like a maiden aunt with her prize roses." Poirot's hand stilled for a moment, and he turned from the mirror with dignity. "Fussing, Monsieur Hastings? You wound me. These," he gestured to his mustaches with evident pride, "are not merely facial hair. They are a work of art. The finest mustaches in all of England." "England?" I chuckled. "Come now, old fellow. Surely that's laying it on a bit thick." "Thick?" Poirot's eyebrows rose to dangerous heights. "I will have you know that only last week Mrs. Petton remarked to me that they were quite the most distinguished mustaches she had ever beheld. And she, as you well know, has met the Prince of Wales on no fewer than 3 occasions." Before I could respond to this rather circular logic, there came a sharp rap at the door. George, Poirot's immaculate valet, appeared with his customary silent efficiency. "A telegram, sir, marked most urgent." Poirot accepted the yellow envelope. With a slight frown, his morning ritual forgotten, I watched as his eyes scanned the contents, noting the familiar transformation that came over his features when a case presented itself, the sharpening of attention, the subtle straightening of his compact frame. "Tiens," he murmured, then looked up at me with those penetrating eyes. "It appears, Hastings, that your return is most fortuitously timed. We are summoned to Yorkshire." "Yorkshire?" I echoed, my pulse quickening with the old familiar thrill. "What's happened?" Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace the length of his sitting room with quick, precise steps. "A murder, mon ami. A most peculiar murder, if this telegram is to be believed." He paused to reread the message. "It is from a Mrs. Aldridge, proprietor of Mond House, a boarding house, she says, though once a grand manor. One of her lodgers, a Mr. Septimus Hale, has been found dead." Natural causes? I ventured, though something in Poirot's manner suggested otherwise. Murdered, Poirot corrected, bludgeoned to death, and in the most extraordinary circumstances. Poirot's eyes gleamed. He was discovered inside a wardrobe, Hastings, a massive antique wardrobe in what Mrs. Aldridge refers to as the haunted room. The haunted room? Despite my years of experience with Poirot's cases, I felt a familiar shiver of unease. Good heavens. But that is not all, Poirot continued, warming to his subject. A medium, one Madame Zelda, had been conducting a séance when the murder occurred. She was found outside the room with blood upon her scarf, claiming that the spirits themselves drove her to violence. I leaned forward in my chair, captivated despite myself. Spirits, Poirot, surely you don't believe what I believe. Mon ami, Poirot interrupted, is that the human mind is capable of the most ingenious deceptions, both of others and of itself. But, he added, his fingers drumming against his waistcoat, it is the details that intrigue Poirot. The wardrobe, the séance, the blood upon the scarf. Security, is it not? Indeed, it already felt familiar. The old excitement building. The prospect of another investigation. Another puzzle to unravel. The ranch in Argentina, with its wide skies and simple problems, seemed suddenly very far away. Poirot moved to his desk and began gathering papers with characteristic efficiency. Mrs. Aldridge pleads for immediate assistance. The local inspector, one Grimby, appears to consider the case closed, but she harbors doubts about Madame Zelda's guilt. When do we leave? I asked, already knowing the answer. The AIs. 11:30. Train from King's Cross. Poirot replied without hesitation. That gives us precisely 47 minutes to prepare. I suggest you return to your lodgings for suitable clothing. Yorkshire in October can be most unforgiving. As I rose to go, I paused at the door. I say, Poirot, it's good to be back. My friend looked up from his packing, his face softening slightly. And it is good to have you back, Hastings. These past 3 years, the cases, they have lacked a certain, companionship. 20 minutes later, I returned with my hastily packed valise to find Poirot waiting by the door, immaculate as always in his traveling coat and perfectly polished shoes. The telegram lay folded on the side table, its urgent message having already set in motion the familiar machinery of investigation. We descended the stairs of Whitehaven Mansions together, stepping out into the crisp October morning. London bustled around us with its usual energy, but my mind was already racing ahead to Yorkshire, to Mond House, and to the mystery that awaited us there. Chapter 2. Journey to Mond House. The first-class compartment of the 11:30 to York provided the perfect sanctuary for Poirot's methodical exposition of the case. As the London suburbs gave way to the rolling countryside, my friend arranged Mrs. Aldridge's correspondence on the small table between us with the precision of a chess master positioning his pieces. Now, Hastings, he began, adjusting his reading glasses, let us examine what we know of this establishment and its inhabitants. I settled back into the plush upholstery, watching the autumn landscape blur past the window. Mond House. Wasn't that the seat of some old Yorkshire family? Précisément. The Morland family held the estate for nearly 4 centuries, before the present generation found themselves, shall we say, in reduced circumstances. Poirot consulted a letter written on cream-colored paper in a feminine hand. Mrs. Aldridge purchased the property some 5 years ago and converted it into what she terms Gentile lodgings for discerning guests. Rather a come-down for such a grand old place, I observed. Perhaps, but Mrs. Aldridge has, shown considerable ingenuity in marketing what might otherwise be considered a liability, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming with professional interest. You see, Hastings, manned house possesses what the modern world finds irresistible. A ghost. Ghost? I felt that familiar quickening of pulse that supernatural tales invariably produced in me. The spirit of one Lady Margaret Morland, who met her tragic end in 1847. She was but 19 years of age, engaged to be married to a neighboring landowner, when she was discovered dead in her bedchamber under mysterious circumstances. Poirot paused to sip from his traveling flask of tisane. Some whispered of suicide, others of accident, but the family maintained she had been murdered by a rejected suitor who was never brought to justice. And she haunts the house? So Mrs. Aldridge would have her guests believe. The room where Lady Margaret died, now designated the haunted room, commands a premium rate. Guests come from London and beyond, seeking the thrill of a supernatural encounter. I shook my head in amazement. And people actually pay extra for the privilege of being frightened out of their wits? Mais oui, Mrs. Aldridge reports that the room is booked continuously throughout the season. Indeed, it was for this very reason that Mr. Septimus Hale had taken residence there. The victim? I leaned forward with interest. A gentleman of middle years, described by Mrs. Aldridge as scholarly in appearance and most respectable in manner. He claimed to be researching psychic phenomena for a book he was writing on the subject. Poirot consulted another letter. He had been in residence for nearly a fortnight when the fatal séance was arranged. And the other residents, surely, there must be other lodgers? Indeed there are, and a most interesting collection they make. Poirot arranged several sheets of paper before him. First, we have Colonel Frobisher, a military gentleman of the old school, recently retired from service in India. Sounds harmless enough. Then there is Miss Penelope Marsh, a governess between positions, apparently of a nervous disposition, much given to reading romantic novels and taking solitary walks in the grounds. I nodded, picturing the typical spinster lady one encountered in such establishments. Dr. Thornfield presents a more complex character, Poirot continued, a physician who has taken residence at Mond House while writing what he terms a scientific treatise on feminine hysteria and related psychological aberrations. Rather a dry subject for a holiday retreat, eh? But perhaps the most intriguing resident, Poirot said, is one Mr. Blackwood, who claims to be researching the history of the house and surrounding area. Mrs. Aldridge notes that he displays an almost uncanny knowledge of local folklore and family genealogies. The train rounded a curve, and I caught sight of a medieval church tower rising from a cluster of stone cottages. We were well into Yorkshire now, and something about the stark beauty of the landscape seemed to lend credence to tales of ghostly visitations. What of this Madame Zelda? I asked. The medium who was found with blood on her scarf? Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. A most curious figure. According to Mrs. Aldridge's account, she appeared at Mond House only 3 days before the murder, claiming to have been called by the spirits to commune with Lady Margaret's restless soul. Rather convenient timing, n'est-ce pas? She requested the séance be held in the haunted room itself, with all the residents in attendance. Mrs. Aldridge admits she was initially reluctant. Such proceedings might disturb the other guests, but Madame Zelda was most persuasive. And during this séance, Hale was murdered, so it would appear. According to the preliminary report from Inspector Grimby, the lights were extinguished for the spiritual manifestations. When they were relit, Mr. Hale was missing from the circle. A search revealed his body crammed into the great wardrobe that dominates one wall of the room. I suppressed a shudder. Ghastly business. and Madame Zelda found outside the room in what Mrs. Aldridge describes as a state of complete hysteria, her scarf stained with what appeared to be blood. She claimed to remember nothing after the spirits began to communicate, insisting she had been possessed by vengeful forces beyond her control. The train began to slow, and I noticed we were approaching a station. Poirot consulted his pocket, watch with his usual precision. "We change trains here for the branch line to Moorhaven," he announced, beginning to gather his papers. "The final portion of our journey will take us through some of Yorkshire's most atmospheric countryside, most appropriate for our present investigation." As we transferred our luggage to the smaller, more rustic train that would complete our journey, I found myself studying the stark moorland that stretched away in all directions. The sky had grown gray and threatening, and a chill wind carried the scent of approaching rain. "Tell me, Poirot," I said as we settled into our new compartment, "what's your initial impression of this case?" My friend was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the rolling hills dotted with ancient stone walls. "There are several elements that strike me as too convenient. The timing of Madame Zelda's arrival, the request for a séance in the very room where the murder occurred, the theatrical nature of the entire proceeding." "You suspect it was staged?" "I suspect, mon ami, that we are dealing with minds far more calculating than the local authorities have recognized. But," he added with a slight smile, "that is precisely what makes such cases interesting." To Poirot. The little train wound its way through increasingly wild countryside, past abandoned farmsteads and ancient burial mounds that spoke of Yorkshire's long and often violent history. As evening approached and the first drops of rain began to spatter against our window, I caught sight of our destination rising from the moors ahead. A great Gothic pile of blackened stone, its towers and battlements silhouetted dramatically against the stormy sky. Manned House awaited us, shrouded in mist and mystery, its windows glowing like watchful eyes in the gathering dusk. Chapter 3. The Scene of the Crime. Mrs. Aldridge met us at the imposing front door of Manned House, her hands twisting nervously in her black silk apron. She was a woman of perhaps 55 years, with prematurely gray hair and the sort of anxious expression that suggested she had spent the better part of her life expecting the worst to happen. Tonight, it appeared her pessimism had been vindicated. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," she exclaimed, ushering us quickly into the oak-paneled entrance hall. "Thank heavens you've come. I've scarcely slept a wink since it happened. The other guests are in such a state, and Inspector Grimby seems quite convinced he has his murderer, but I cannot help feeling—" She trailed off, wringing her hands with renewed vigor. "What is it that troubles you, madame?" Poirot inquired gently, removing his overcoat with careful precision. "It's Madame Zelda, you see. I know what the evidence suggests, but she seems so genuinely terrified. When I found her outside the haunted room, she was trembling like a leaf and quite beside herself with horror. I've seen many theatrical displays in my time, running an establishment like this, but her fear seemed real." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And where is the lady now?" "In the small parlor on the ground floor. Inspector Grimby has placed her under guard, though he's allowed her to remain here rather than taking her to the local station. Professional courtesy to the establishment, he said, though I suspect he simply didn't want the bother of proper facilities for a female prisoner." "Most considerate of him," Poirot murmured. "But first, if you would be so good, we should like to examine the scene of the crime." Mrs. Aldridge led us up a grand staircase that had clearly seen better days. The carpet was worn in places, and several of the family portraits that lined the walls bore the telltale rectangles of faded wallpaper, where smaller paintings had once hung, sold, no doubt, to meet pressing financial obligations. The haunted room is in the East Wing, Mrs. Aldridge explained as we walked down a long corridor lit by electric fixtures that had been retrofitted into ancient gas brackets. It was Lady Margaret's private chamber in the old days. The family sealed it after her death, and it remained undisturbed for nearly 60 years until I had it reopened and refurbished. She paused before an oak door that stood slightly ajar. Inspector Grimby is inside with Constable Morrison. He's been most thorough, I must say, though perhaps not as delicate as one might wish. Indeed, the sound of heavy footsteps and occasional grunts of exertion suggested a less than subtle approach to criminal investigation. "Inspector Grimby?" Mrs. Aldridge called out as she knocked gently on the doorframe. "Hi, come in then," came a gruff Yorkshire voice, though there's not much more to see that we haven't catalogued already. Inspector Grimby proved to be a large, red-faced man with the sort of practical manner that suggested he preferred his crime straightforward, and his criminals caught red-handed. He eyed Poirot with barely concealed skepticism as Mrs. Aldridge performed the introductions. "Belgian detective, eh?" "Well, I suppose there's no harm in having a look, though the case is as clear as Yorkshire pudding to my mind." I surveyed the room with considerable interest. It was dominated by an enormous Tudor wardrobe that occupied the better part of one wall. A massive piece of dark oak, intricately carved with heraldic devices and standing nearly 8 feet in height. The doors stood open, revealing the cramped interior where Septimus Hale had met his end. Poirot moved about the room with his characteristic precision, his keen eyes taking in every detail. He examined the wardrobe first, running his fingers along the carved panels and peering intently at the interior. "The body was discovered in this position?" he inquired, indicating the wardrobe's interior. "Crammed in like a sack of grain," Inspector Grimby confirmed with professional detachment. "Had to be forced in there after death. No man could have squeezed himself into such a space while living." "Intrigant," Poirot murmured, kneeling to examine the wardrobe's base. "And the weapon?" he asked. "A brass candlestick from the mantelpiece there." Grimby pointed to the fireplace, where one of a pair of ornate candlesticks was conspicuously absent. "Found it right beside the body, covered in blood and hair. Nasty business." I noticed Poirot's attention had shifted to a narrow corridor that ran behind the haunted room, its entrance partially concealed by a tapestry that had been pushed aside. "This passage," he said. "Where does it lead?" "Servants' corridor from the old days," Mrs. Aldridge explained. "It's been shuttered up since the conversion, no longer needed with the reduced staff. There's just a narrow space back there now, used for storage." "I see," Poirot said, though his tone suggested he found this information particularly significant. "And during the séance, the room was in complete darkness?" "So they all claim," Inspector Grimby said with a snort. "Very convenient for our murderer, I'd say. Perfect cover for her bloody work." "The séance itself," I interjected, "how was it conducted?" Mrs. Aldridge wrung her hands again. "They were all seated around this table here." She indicated a round table that had been pushed against one wall. "Madame Zelda insisted on having the lights extinguished completely to facilitate communication with Lady Margaret's spirit. She had brought various props to enhance the atmosphere." "Props?" Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Theatrical items, I suppose you'd call them. A crystal ball, some curious bottles, silk scarves, the sort of things mediums use for their demonstrations." "And where are these items now?" Inspector Grimby gestured toward a small collection of objects arranged on a side table, bagged and catalogued. "Though I can't see what bearing they have on the case. The woman's scarf tells the whole story, blood all over it, plain as day." Poirot approached the evidence table and examined the items with great care, paying particular attention to a length of dark blue silk that was indeed stained with what appeared to be dried blood. "This scarf," he said, "it belongs to Madame Zelda?" "Claims it does," Grimby replied. "Says she has no memory of how the blood came to be on it. Convenient memory loss, if you ask me." "Peut-être," Poirot murmured, though whether he was agreeing with the inspector's assessment or making some other observation was unclear. He completed his examination of the room with methodical thoroughness, paying particular attention to the window fastenings, the chimney flue, and the positioning of the furniture. Finally, he straightened and dusted off his hands with evident satisfaction. "I should very much like to speak with Madame Zelda," he announced. "Right then," Inspector Grimby said, leading the way back downstairs. "Though I warn you she's been carrying on something dreadful about spirits and supernatural forces. Complete nonsense, if you want my opinion." The small parlor where Madame Zelda waited proved to be a cozy room furnished with chintz-covered chairs and watercolor landscapes of the Yorkshire countryside. The woman herself was a startling contrast to these gentle surroundings, a dramatic figure in her 40s with wild dark hair and eyes that held a peculiar intensity. She looked up as we entered, and I was immediately struck by the genuine terror that seemed to radiate from her entire being. "You are the famous detective," she said to Poirot, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Aldridge told me you were coming. Perhaps you at least will understand that there are forces at work here beyond the comprehension of ordinary men." Poirot settled himself in the chair opposite her with characteristic care, his green eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me, madame," he said quietly, "what do you remember of last evening's events?" Chapter 4. The Residence of Mond House, our interview with Madame Zelda had proved both illuminating and frustrating in equal measure. Her account of the séance, delivered in dramatic whispers punctuated by sudden silences, painted a picture of supernatural manifestations that would have been worthy of the most sensational penny dreadful. Yet beneath the theatrical presentation, I detected a core of genuine fear that seemed impossible to counterfeit. The spirits were most agitated, she had insisted, her dark eyes wide with remembered terror. Lady Margaret herself spoke through me, warning of danger, of blood, of vengeance, long delayed. Then came the other presence, something dark and malevolent that sought to use me as its instrument. After that, she had shuddered dramatically. Nothing, complete darkness, until I found myself outside the room with that dreadful stain upon my scarf. Now, as Poirot and I prepared to interview the other residents, I found myself wondering how much credence to give her supernatural explanations. My friend, characteristically, had listened to every word with grave attention, while revealing nothing of his own thoughts. "We shall speak with each resident individually," Poirot had announced to Mrs. Aldridge after our session with the medium. "It is essential that we understand the precise circumstances of last evening's events." Our first interview was with Colonel Frobisher, whom we found in the morning room reading the Times, with the sort of methodical attention that suggested a lifetime of military discipline. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with steel-gray hair and a slight limp that spoke of old service injuries. "Terrible business," he declared, rising stiffly to shake our hands. "Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised, given the sort of nonsense that woman was peddling." "You refer to Madame Zelda?" Poirot inquired, settling into a leather armchair that had seen better days. "Indeed I do. All that supernatural rubbish, seances and spirit communications, and heaven knows what else. In my experience, such proceedings attract the worst sort of charlatans and confidence tricksters." "Yet you attended the séance yourself," I observed. Colonel Frobisher's weathered face colored slightly. Mrs. Aldridge and Miss Marsh were quite insistent. Didn't want to appear churlish, you understand. Besides, he added with evident embarrassment, my late wife had something of an interest in such matters. Thought I might, well, no. Matter now. And during the proceedings? Poirot prompted gently. Lot of theatrical nonsense, if you ask me. Darkened room, mysterious sounds, the medium carrying on about restless spirits. I'm afraid I may have dozed off during the more dramatic portions. Old campaigners' habit, you know, sleep when you can. You saw nothing of the actual crime? Nothing whatsoever. One moment we were all sitting around that confounded table, listening to Madame Zelda's dramatics. The next, there was screaming and confusion when the lights came up. Poor Hale was nowhere to be seen. And, your impression of Mr. Hale himself? The Colonel's expression grew thoughtful. Quiet fellow, scholarly type. Kept to himself mostly, though he seemed pleasant enough when one encountered him at meals. Always reading books about ghosts and psychical research and such. Did he seem troubled by anything? Worried, perhaps? Hard to say. He did receive several letters during his stay here. Seemed rather concerned about something to do with his business affairs in London. But then, most of us have our worries, don't we? Our next interview was with Miss Penelope Marsh, whom we found in the conservatory, tending to a collection of potted plants with the sort of nervous energy that suggested she needed constant occupation to calm her fears. She was a thin woman, of indeterminate age, with faded brown hair and hands that trembled slightly as she spoke. Such a dreadful occurrence, she whispered, glancing about as though spirits might be lurking behind the geraniums. I've scarcely slept a wink since it happened. Every shadow, every creak of the old house. You were present at the séance, Miss Marsh? Poirot asked kindly. Oh, yes, though I almost didn't attend. I find such things quite terrifying. You understand. But Madame Zelda was so persuasive, and Mrs. Aldridge thought it would be interesting for the guests. And what did you observe during the proceedings? Miss Marsh's pale eyes grew wide with remembered fear. It was horrible. Truly horrible. The room was pitch black, and there were such strange sounds, rappings and whispers, and at one point I could have sworn I felt icy fingers brush against my cheek. You saw nothing of what happened to Mr. Hale? Nothing. One moment he was there beside me, I could hear his breathing and then silence. When Madame Zelda began screaming and Mrs. Aldridge lit the gas, his chair was empty. Did Mr. Hale seem apprehensive before the séance began? Now that you mention it, yes. He appeared quite agitated during dinner. He kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the door as though expecting someone. Dr. Thornfield presented a marked contrast to the nervous governess. We found him in the library, a thin, intellectual man with penetrating gray eyes and the sort of precise manner that spoke of scientific training. He greeted us with clinical detachment as though we were specimens for his psychological studies. A fascinating case from the perspective of mass hysteria, he observed, gesturing for us to take seats among the dusty volumes. The power of suggestion in such circumstances can produce the most remarkable effects upon the human psyche. You believe the supernatural manifestations were artificially produced? Poirot inquired. Undoubtedly. I've made something of a study of such phenomena. The techniques employed by spiritualist mediums to create the impression of supernatural contact. Quite ingenious, really, though hardly mysterious once one understands the methodology. And yet a man died, I pointed out, which suggests that someone used the cover of these theatrical proceedings to commit a very real crime. The darkness, the confusion, The focus on supernatural explanations, all perfect conditions for murder. Your observations during the seance itself. Dr. Thornfield steepled his fingers thoughtfully. I remained as objective as possible, naturally, the usual repertoire of tricks, mysterious sounds, moving objects, sudden temperature changes. Madame Zelda was quite skilled, I must admit. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Hale's behavior? He seemed unusually tense, certainly. During dinner, I observed him examining a letter that appeared to cause him considerable distress. When I inquired if anything was amiss, he claimed it was merely business correspondence, but his manner suggested otherwise. Our final interview was with Mr. Blackwood, and it proved the most intriguing of all. We found him in the billiard room, a pale, intense man of perhaps 40 years, who seemed to possess an almost encyclopedic knowledge of Mand House and its tragic history. Lady Margaret's death was never properly investigated, he declared without preamble, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond our shoulders. The authorities were too eager to accept the family's version of events, but I've spent considerable time researching the matter, and there are inconsistencies. You believe she was murdered? Poirot asked with evident interest. I'm convinced of it. The timing, the circumstances, the subsequent cover-up all point to foul play. And now, nearly a century later, another death occurs in the very same room. You suggest a connection? Mr. Blackwood's smile was enigmatic. The past has a way of refusing to stay buried, Mr. Poirot, particularly when injustice has been done. And during last evening's séance, I observed everything with great attention. The manifestations were quite remarkable, far beyond anything I've encountered in my studies of psychical phenomena. Whatever force Madame Zelda contacted, it was genuinely powerful. You saw nothing of the actual murder? The darkness was complete. But I sensed presences moving about the room, and there was a moment when I could have sworn I heard Lady Margaret's voice speaking of vengeance at last fulfilled. As we concluded our interviews and retired to our rooms for the evening, I found myself more confused than enlightened. Each resident had provided a slightly different account of the séance, yet all agreed on the essential facts: the complete darkness, the supernatural manifestations, and the mysterious disappearance of Septimus Hale. What struck me most forcibly was how each person seemed to be concealing something, whether from fear, embarrassment, or more sinister motives. Poirot, characteristically, had listened to every word with apparent fascination, while asking seemingly irrelevant questions about London newspapers, business partnerships, and travel arrangements. As I settled into bed in my comfortable but decidedly chilly room, I could hear the Yorkshire wind howling around the ancient walls of Mand House, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with forces far more complex than a simple case of murder during a séance. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Spiritualist. The morning brought a grey Yorkshire dawn that seemed to seep through the very stones of Mand House. I found Poirot in the breakfast room, meticulously buttering his toast while studying a collection of papers spread before him, with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "Ah, Hastings," he said without looking up. "You arrive at the perfect moment. I have been examining the personal effects of our unfortunate Mr. Hale, and they present most interesting contradictions." Inspector Grimby, who sat across the table nursing a cup of strong tea, snorted with evident skepticism. Contradictions? The man was writing a book about ghosts and spirits. Hardly surprising he'd have peculiar reading material. "Sir," Poirot agreed mildly, "but observe, if you please, these items." He indicated a leather portfolio that lay open beside his plate. "Here we have notes on psychical phenomena, correspondence with various spiritualist societies, and research materials concerning Lady Margaret's tragic history. I examined the contents with growing interest. Hale's handwriting was precise and scholarly, his notes methodical in their organization. Yet something about the material struck me as oddly clinical for a true believer in supernatural phenomena. But here, Poirot continued, producing a separate bundle of letters tied with string, we find correspondence of an entirely different nature. Business letters, Hastings, concerning the firm of Hale and Whitmore. Importers. Importers? I echoed, surprised. I understood he was a writer and researcher. As did we all. Yet these letters reveal that Mr. Septimus Hale was in fact a partner in a moderately successful importing business with offices in Cheapside. Poirot selected one letter from the bundle. This particular communication, dated merely 1 week ago, suggests that all was not well with the firm's finances. Inspector Grimby leaned forward with grudging interest. What sort of troubles? The letter is from one Marcus Whitmore, evidently Mr. Hale's business partner. It speaks of discrepancies in the accounts and urgent need for clarification of recent transactions. Poirot's green eyes glinted. Most significantly, it requests that Hale return to London immediately to discuss what Whitmore terms irregularities that cannot be ignored. So, I mused, our spiritualist had worldly concerns after all. Indeed. And notice the date of this communication. It arrived at Mond House on the very day that Madame Zelda appeared, claiming to have been called by the spirits to conduct her séance. This coincidence seemed to capture even Inspector Grimby's attention. You think there's a connection? I think, mon ami, that we must examine all possibilities with equal care. Poirot folded the letters with characteristic precision. Which brings us to the equally intriguing background of our mysterious medium. He produced a telegram that bore the previous day's date. I took the liberty of making certain inquiries through official channels. It appears that Madame Zelda is, in fact, Mrs. Dorothy Crimond of Stroud, a respectable widow with no previous history of spiritualist activities. Stroud? Inspector Grimby looked genuinely surprised. That's a far cry from the exotic background she's been claiming. Précisément. But more interesting still is the manner of her arrival at Mond House. Poirot consulted another document. According to the station master at Moorhaven, Mrs. Crimond, or Madame Zelda, arrived by the afternoon train 3 days ago, carrying a single carpet bag and what he described as a collection of theatrical properties. Theatrical properties, items one might associate with stage magic or dramatic performances, crystal balls, silk scarves, bottles of curious liquids. Precisely. The sort of apparatus we discovered in the haunted room. I felt a growing excitement as the implications became clear. You suspect she was hired to perform this séance? The possibility cannot be ignored. And if so, by whom and for what purpose? Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace the length of the breakfast room. But there is another element to consider, one that Inspector Grimby's thorough investigation has brought to light. The inspector looked pleased at this rare praise. You mean the matter of the blood-stained scarf? Exactement. Yesterday evening, while you were interviewing the residents, the good inspector conducted certain scientific tests upon the stained fabric. The results were most illuminating. Well, I prompted impatiently, the blood upon Madame Zelda's scarf is not human in origin. I stared at him in astonishment. Not human? But then what? Porcine blood, to be precise. The blood of a pig. Poirot's expression was one of quiet satisfaction, which suggests that the staining was deliberate, part of the theatrical apparatus designed to enhance the supernatural atmosphere of the séance. Inspector Grimby shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, that does put a different complexion on things, but the woman still had opportunity. And if she was hired to commit murder— If indeed— Poirot interrupted gently. But consider, Inspector. Why would a murderer arrange to be discovered with evidence that would immediately point to her guilt? Surely a more subtle approach would serve better. Unless she panicked, Grimby suggested stubbornly. Perhaps, but I am reminded of a curious advertisement that appeared in the Times personal column some 10 days ago. Poirot produced a newspaper clipping from his waistcoat pocket. Dramatic lady of sensibility required for special appearances in Yorkshire. Theatrical experience preferred. Excellent remuneration for suitable candidate. Apply box 247. The silence that followed this revelation was pregnant with implication. You believe Madame Zelda, Mrs. Cremond, answered this advertisement? I believe it is a possibility that merits investigation. And if so, we must ask ourselves, who placed such an advertisement, and why? Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the doorway at that moment, wringing her hands with characteristic anxiety. I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but there's been a development. A gentleman has arrived from London, claiming to be a business associate of poor Mr. Hale. He's most insistent about speaking with the authorities. His name? Poirot? Inquired sharply. Mr. Marcus Whitmore, sir. He says he's come as soon as he heard the dreadful news. The name hung in the air like an electric charge. I caught Poirot's eye and saw my own thoughts reflected there. The convenient timing of this arrival, coming so soon after our discovery of the troubling correspondence. Where is Mr. Whitmore now? Inspector Grimby asked, rising from his chair with newfound energy. In the main drawing-room, sir. He seems quite distraught about his partner's death, though he's anxious to discuss certain business matters that he claims cannot wait. Il faut, Poirot murmured. Perhaps we should meet this grieving partner and learn what urgent business brings him to Yorkshire so promptly. As we made our way toward the drawing-room, I found my mind racing with possibilities. The mysterious advertisement, the theatrical blood on Madame Zelda's scarf, the financial troubles of Hale and Whitmore, and now the convenient arrival of the dead man's business partner, all seemed to be pieces of a puzzle far more complex than a simple murder during a séance. The drawing-room door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see a man of middle years pacing before the fireplace with obvious agitation. He was well dressed, but bore the unmistakable signs of hasty travel, rumpled clothing, unkempt hair, and the sort of restless energy that spoke of extreme nervous tension. As we approached the door, I heard him speaking in urgent tones to someone I could not see. The timing is most unfortunate, he was saying, but certain arrangements cannot be delayed. The accounts must be settled before anyone begins asking inconvenient questions. Poirot raised a warning finger to his lips, and we paused to listen more carefully. Whatever secrets lay behind Septimus Hale's death, it seemed we were about to encounter another player in this increasingly complex drama. Chapter 6. The Hidden Mechanism. Our interview with Marcus Whitmore had proven as enlightening as it was disturbing. The man himself was a study in barely controlled anxiety, a thin, sharp-featured gentleman whose expensive clothing could not disguise the telltale signs of financial strain. His explanation for the urgent journey to Yorkshire rang hollow even to Inspector Grimby's practical ears. Partnership dissolution, he had insisted, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief that trembled in his grasp. Septimus and I had been discussing the matter for some weeks. His death, tragic though, leaves certain legal complications that require immediate attention. Yet when pressed for specifics about these urgent business matters, Whitmore had grown evasive, speaking in generalities about market conditions and outstanding obligations that seemed to shift and change with each explanation. Most curious, Poirot had murmured after Whitmore excused himself to attend to correspondence in his hastily arranged room. A man travels from London with such urgency to discuss partnership dissolution, yet cannot specify what pressing matters require his immediate presence. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Yorkshire moors, Poirot had requested a return visit to the haunted room. Inspector Grimby, though skeptical of what he termed foreign detective methods, had grudgingly agreed to accompany us. "I fail to see what more we can learn from that cursed chamber," he grumbled, as we climbed the worn stairs. "The evidence speaks for itself. Murder weapon, blood-stained scarf, opportunity during the darkness of the séance." "Evidence, yes," Poirot agreed pleasantly, "but perhaps not the evidence we have been encouraged to see." The haunted room seemed different in the pale afternoon light filtering through its leaded windows. The massive wardrobe that had dominated our previous visits now appeared less menacing, more like what it truly was, an impressive piece of Tudor craftsmanship that had witnessed centuries of family history. Poirot approached the wardrobe with renewed interest, running his hands along its carved surfaces with the delicate touch of a connoisseur examining a fine painting. "Hastings," he said, "observe the construction of this piece. What strikes you as unusual?" I studied the wardrobe carefully, noting its elaborate heraldic carvings and the quality of the dark oak. "It's certainly a magnificent example of period furniture. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Précisément. But notice also the proportions." Poirot knelt beside the wardrobe's base, his fingers tracing the ornate molding that ran along its bottom edge. The interior space seemed somewhat diminutive compared to what the external dimensions would suggest. Inspector Grimby looked on with poorly concealed impatience. "What are you driving at, Mr. Poirot?" "I am driving at the possibility that appearances, in this case as in so many others, may be deceptive." Poirot's fingers found something along the carved base that made him pause. "Aha! Voila! Inspector, if you would be so good as to assist me in moving this wardrobe slightly away from the wall." "Move it?" Grimby protested. "The thing must weigh half a ton." "Not move entirely, merely shift it enough to examine the wall behind. I suspect we may find something of considerable interest." With considerable effort, the three of us managed to angle the massive piece of furniture far enough from the wall to reveal the space behind it. What we discovered there made even Inspector Grimby whistle with surprise. Set into the wall at approximately the height of the wardrobe's base was a narrow panel that had been cleverly concealed by the furniture's positioning. The panel showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Fresh scratches around its edges and a small pile of sawdust that suggested recent carpentry work. "Well, I'll be damned," Grimby muttered, kneeling to examine the hidden opening. "A secret panel, right behind where the murder was committed." Poirot produced his pocket torch and directed its beam into the opening. The narrow passage beyond was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but it clearly led somewhere. Within the house's structure. The servants' corridor, I realized suddenly. Mrs. Aldridge mentioned it had been shuttered when the house was converted. "Exactement, mon ami. And observe the fresh tool marks around this opening. Someone has recently enlarged what was once a much smaller aperture, perhaps originally intended for maintenance access to the wardrobe's interior mechanisms." Inspector Grimby was beginning to show genuine interest in Poirot's investigation. "You're suggesting someone used this passage to access the wardrobe from behind?" "I am suggesting that the murderer may have had means of reaching the Scene of the crime without being observed by the séance participants. Poirot turned his attention back to the wardrobe itself, examining its interior with his magnifying glass. And here, if I am not mistaken, we find confirmation of that theory. He indicated a section of the wardrobe's rear panel that, upon close inspection, showed signs of having been recently removed and replaced. The wood grain didn't quite match, and there were fresh scratches around what appeared to be concealed hinges. "A false back," Grimby said, his voice filled with growing excitement. "Someone could have hidden the murder weapon inside. The wardrobe structure then retrieved it through this passage. Or," Poirot added quietly, "concealed other items of significance, items that might have provided motive for murder." We spent the better part of an hour examining the hidden compartment and the passage that led to it. The corridor beyond proved to be a narrow service tunnel that ran behind several of the house's main rooms, eventually connecting to a larger passage that emerged near the servants' stair. "Ingenious," I admitted as we made our way back through the cramped space. Someone with knowledge of the house's original layout could move through these passages undetected. But who would possess such knowledge? Inspector Grimby wondered aloud. It was a question that had been troubling me as well. Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned that the servants' passages had been sealed during the conversion. Yet someone had not only known of their existence, but had taken considerable trouble to modify them for their own purposes. "We must examine the guest ledger more carefully," Poirot announced as we emerged from our exploration, dusty and somewhat worse for wear. "Particularly the records of who has stayed in the haunted room during recent months." Mrs. Aldridge produced the leather-bound register with obvious reluctance. "I hope you don't think I've been careless about my guests, Mr. Poirot. I maintain very careful records." "I'm certain you do, madame, but I am particularly interested in reservations made for the haunted room during, shall we say, the past 6 months. As we examined the entries, a pattern began to emerge that made my pulse quicken. The haunted room had indeed been popular with guests seeking supernatural thrills, but one name appeared with curious frequency, a Mr. M. Blackwood, who had reserved the room for 3 separate occasions during the summer months. "Blackwood," I said, glancing at Poirot. "The same surname as our current resident who claims to be researching the house's history." "Coincidence curious," Poirot murmured, but his tone suggested the coincidence was anything but curious to his analytical mind. Inspector Grimby was examining the entries with growing interest. "Different initials, though." The guest. "Ledger shows Monsieur Blackwood, while our current resident signed in as Arthur Blackwood." "Indeed. And notice, if you please, the method of payment for these earlier visits." Poirot indicated the relevant columns in the ledger. "Bank drafts, rather than cash or personal checks. Most convenient for maintaining anonymity." The implications were becoming clearer with each revelation. Someone had taken considerable trouble to study Mand House and its hidden passages, making multiple visits under an assumed name, and paying in a manner that would leave minimal trace of their identity. "But why?" I asked aloud. "What could justify such elaborate preparation?" Poirot closed the guest ledger with a decisive snap. "I believe, Hastings, that we are beginning to understand the true scope of this crime. What appeared to be a simple murder during a séance may in fact be the culmination of a plan months in the making." As evening approached, and we prepared for dinner, I found myself studying the other residents with renewed suspicion. The discovery of the hidden passages and the mysterious repeated visits by Monsieur Blackwood had transformed my understanding of the case entirely. What we were dealing with was not a crime of passion or supernatural possession, but a carefully orchestrated plot that had used the haunted room's reputation and the séance's theatrical chaos as perfect cover for murder. The question that remained was, which of our seemingly innocent fellow guests was in fact a calculating killer who had spent months preparing for this moment? Chapter 7. The Web Unravels. The morning brought news that would transform our understanding of the case entirely. A telegram from London lay waiting on the breakfast table, its urgent contents having arrived during the night. Poirot read it with the sort of quiet satisfaction that indicated his methodical inquiries were bearing fruit. "What is it?" I asked, noting the gleam of triumph in his green eyes. "Confirmation, mon ami, of certain suspicions that have been forming in the mind of Poirot." He passed the telegram across to me. "From my contacts at Scotland Yard regarding one Marcus Whitmore and his recent activities. Whitmore's bank accounts show large withdrawals past month. Business premises closed suddenly last week. Creditors seeking whereabouts. Suggest urgent investigation. Partnership finances." Inspector Grimby, who had been consuming his breakfast with Yorkshire thoroughness, looked up with sudden interest. "Financial troubles, eh? That puts a different light on his urgent journey." "Here." "Indeed it does," Poirot agreed. "But there is more. I have also received confirmation regarding the mysterious advertisement in the Times." He produced a second telegram. The box number was registered to 1 M. Blackwood of a Cheapside address. The very same address, it transpires, as the offices of Hale and Whitmore, importers. The implications struck me immediately. Whitmore placed the advertisement, seeking a dramatic lady for Yorkshire appearances. "So it would appear," Poirot said, "which raises the intriguing question of why a London businessman would require the services of such a person at precisely the time his partner was staying in a haunted room." Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Aldridge, who appeared even more flustered than usual. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but something most peculiar has occurred. Mr. Blackwood, our resident historian, has departed suddenly." "During the night? Departed?" Inspector Grimby set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Without notice?" "Completely without warning. His room is empty, his belongings gone, and he left no forwarding address. Most irregular behavior for such a scholarly gentleman." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "And when precisely did you discover his absence?" "When I went to call him for breakfast, sir. The chambermaid had noticed his bed hadn't been slept in, and all his research materials have vanished." "Research materials? What sort of materials?" Mrs. Aldridge wrung her hands nervously. "Books about the house's history, family genealogies, old estate plans. He'd been most thorough in his studies. Said he was writing a comprehensive history of the Morland family." Poirot was already rising from his chair. "Inspector, I believe we should examine Mr. Blackwood's former room immediately, and perhaps we should also verify whether our Mr. Whitmore remains in residence." The investigation of Blackwood's abandoned room revealed little beyond the haste of his departure. Drawers stood open, hangers hung empty, and there was the sort of disarray that spoke of urgent packing in darkness. Yet Poirot's keen eyes discovered what the rest of us had missed: a small fragment of paper that had fallen behind the writing. "Desk. Voila," he murmured, extracting the scrap with his tweezers. "A portion of what appears to be a bank draft, dated some 3 days ago." The fragment showed only part of the document, but enough remained visible to reveal a significant sum and a partial signature that appeared to read M. Whit. "Whitmore," Inspector Grimby said grimly. "So our mysterious historian was receiving payments from our supposed grieving business partner." "It would appear so. But let us now verify whether Mr. Whitmore himself remains at Mand House. A inquiry at Whitmore's room met with a locked door and no response to repeated knocking. Mrs. Aldridge produced her master key with obvious reluctance, and we entered to find the room as empty as Blackwood's had been. "Gone," she whispered, staring at the vacant space. Both of them vanished in the night, like ghosts themselves. But Poirot was examining the room with his characteristic thoroughness, and his search yielded a discovery that made us all pause. Hidden beneath the mattress was a leather portfolio, containing documents that told a tale of systematic embezzlement and financial fraud. "The partnership records," Poirot announced, spreading the papers across the small writing table. "And most illuminating they are. It appears that Mr. Septimus Hale had discovered significant irregularities in the firm's accounts, money diverted to private accounts, false invoices, inflated expenses." "Embezzlement," Inspector Grimby said flatly, "presses him. Up. And here," Poirot indicated a letter in Hale's familiar handwriting, "we find his ultimatum to his partner. Either full restitution of the stolen funds, or Hale would report the matter to the authorities." The letter was dated just 1 week before Hale's death, and its contents made chilling reading. Hale had discovered the extent of Whitmore's financial crimes and was demanding immediate action to restore the firm's integrity. So Whitmore arranged this elaborate charade to eliminate his partner before the embezzlement could be exposed. I said, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "But observe the sophistication of the plan," Poirot continued, gathering the scattered documents. "Whitmore could not simply murder his partner in London. Too many connections, too much scrutiny. Instead, he researched Hale's interest in psychical phenomena and identified the perfect location for his crime: the haunted room at Mandy House. Exactement. Using the identity of Monsieur Blackwood, he made multiple reconnaissance visits, studying the house's layout and discovering the hidden passages. He then arranged for Hale to stay in the haunted room for his research, hired Mrs. Crimmen to provide theatrical cover as Madame Zelda, and prepared his elaborate alibi. Inspector Grimby was studying the documents with growing excitement. The bank drafts, the false identity, the coordination with the séance. It's all here, in black and white. "But where are they now?" I asked. "Both Whitmore and this Blackwood character have vanished." Poirot was examining something else he'd discovered in the abandoned room, a railway timetable with certain departures marked in pencil. "I suspect, mes amis, that they haven't gone far. See here, the early morning train to Harrogate, with connections to London. If I am not mistaken, our Mr. Whitmore believed his plan had succeeded perfectly." "You mean he thought we would accept Madame Zelda's guilt and close the case?" "Mais oui. The blood-stained scarf, her presence at the scene, her claims of supernatural possession, all designed to provide a convenient culprit while the real murderer escaped with both his freedom and the stolen money he had hidden at Mand House. The revelation that the money itself might still be concealed somewhere in the house sent Inspector Grimby into a flurry of activity. A thorough search of the hidden passages revealed a waterproof case concealed behind a loose stone, containing a substantial sum in banknotes and negotiable securities. "The fruits of his embezzlement," Poirot observed with satisfaction, "hidden away until he could retrieve them safely after the investigation concluded." But even as we celebrated this discovery, a new concern arose. Mrs. Aldridge had been making inquiries about the sudden departures and had learned disturbing news from the village. "The station master remembers them both," she reported breathlessly. "Mr. Whitmore and a man matching Mr. Blackwood's description, traveling together on the early train. But here's the curious thing. They seem to know each other quite well, despite pretending to be strangers here at the house." The implication was clear. The mysterious Arthur Blackwood and Marcus Whitmore were confederates, and both were now fleeing with the knowledge that their elaborate scheme was unraveling. As the day wore on and telegrams flew between Mandhouse and various authorities, I found myself marveling at the complexity of the deception we had uncovered, the use of the haunted room's reputation, the recruitment of an innocent theatrical accomplice, the exploitation of supernatural beliefs, all woven together into a plot that had very nearly succeeded. Yet questions remained. Who exactly was the mysterious Blackwood? And what was his relationship to Whitmore? Had they reached London safely, or were they still within reach of the authorities? And what would become of poor Mrs. Cremond, whose only crime had been answering an advertisement for dramatic work? The answers to these questions would soon become clear, but not in the manner any of us expected. Chapter 8. Poirot Explains. The drawing-room of Mon House had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with Poirot presiding over the assembled company with the quiet authority that always marked his revelations. Mrs. Aldridge sat clutching her handkerchief, while Inspector Grimby occupied a chair near the fireplace, his notebook at the ready. The remaining residents, Colonel Frobisher, Miss Marsh, and Dr. Thornfield, had gathered with expressions of mingled curiosity and apprehension. Most significantly, 2 constables flanked a pale and defeated-looking man who bore little resemblance to the scholarly Arthur Blackwood we had known. Beside him sat Mrs. Dorothy Cremond, no longer the dramatic Madame Zelda, but a frightened middle-aged woman from Stroud, who dabbed constantly at her eyes with a sodden handkerchief. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the room, "we are gathered here to examine one of the most ingenious crimes it has been my privilege to investigate. What appeared to be a supernatural murder has revealed itself as a meticulously planned deception involving false identities, elaborate misdirection, and the cynical exploitation of human nature." He paused, allowing his words to settle upon the assembled company. Let us begin with the victim, Mr. Septimus Hale, whom we knew as a researcher of psychical phenomena. In reality, he was a successful London businessman who had discovered that his partner, Marcus Whitmore, had been systematically embezzling from their firm. Faced with exposure and ruin, Whitmore conceived a plan of diabolical cleverness. Colonel Frobisher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You mean to say this whole business was planned from the beginning?" "Précisément, Colonel, but not by our unfortunate medium here." Poirot indicated Mrs. Cremond with a gentle gesture. Mrs. Cremond, for that is her real name, was merely an unwitting instrument in Whitmore's scheme. "I answered an advertisement," Mrs. Cremond whispered, her voice barely audible. "It seemed like such a wonderful opportunity. Good money for a few days' dramatic work in Yorkshire. I thought it was perfectly legitimate." "And so it appeared," Poirot agreed kindly. "The advertisement sought a dramatic lady of sensibility for special appearances, vague enough to attract someone of theatrical inclinations, specific enough to ensure the right sort of candidate would apply." Inspector Grimby looked up from his notes. "But how did Whitmore know his partner would be at Mon House?" "Ah, Inspector. That is where the true genius of the plan reveals itself." Poirot moved to stand beside the great wardrobe, which had been returned to its original position against the wall. Whitmore did not lure his partner here. He followed him. You see, Hale's interest in psychical research was genuine, and when he learned of the haunted room at Mandhouse, he arranged his own visit to conduct investigations. So Whitmore simply took advantage of his partner's existing plans. More than that, he enhanced them. Using the false identity of Monsieur Blackwood, Whitmore made several reconnaissance visits to Mandhouse during the summer months, studying its layout and discovering the hidden servants' passages that had been sealed during the conversion. Miss Marsh gasped. You mean he'd been here before, planning this dreadful crime? Indeed, Miss Marsh. And during these visits, he modified the ancient wardrobe, creating a hidden compartment accessible from the concealed passage behind the wall. This compartment served a dual purpose. It provided a hiding place for the murder weapon and a secure location for the stolen money he had embezzled from the partnership. Dr. Thornfield leaned forward with professional interest. But the elaborate seance, surely that was unnecessary if he could access the room through hidden passages. On the contrary, Doctor, the seance was essential to his plan. It provided the perfect cover, a darkened room full of distracted participants, supernatural manifestations to explain away any unusual sounds, and most importantly, a ready-made suspect in the person of our theatrical medium. Poirot indicated the blood-stained scarf, later evidence, upon the side table. The pig's blood upon Mrs. Crimmen's scarf was not evidence of guilt, but of innocence. It was part of her theatrical properties, designed to enhance the supernatural atmosphere of the seance, not to implicate her in murder. But I found myself outside the room with no memory of how I got there, Mrs. Crimmen protested tearfully. The terror was real, but I wasn't acting. Non, madame, Poirot said gently. You were not acting. Your terror was genuine because you had witnessed something that your conscious mind could not accept. The brutal murder of Mr. Hale during what you believed to be a harmless theatrical performance. The prisoner, who had maintained sullen silence throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. You cannot prove any of this, he said in a voice that bore only traces of the educated accent we had known as Arthur Blackwood. Circumstantial evidence and wild theories. Can I not? Poirot's eyes glittered dangerously. Let us examine the evidence systematically. First, the bank drafts paid to Monsieur Blackwood for his multiple visits to Mand House, traceable directly to Marcus Whitmore's depleted business accounts. Inspector Grimby rustled through his papers. We have the bank records right enough. Second, the modification of the wardrobe and hidden passage work that required intimate knowledge of the house's original structure, knowledge gained during those preliminary visits. Third, the advertisement in the Times, placed from the offices of Hale and Whitmore, and designed to recruit an unwitting accomplice for the theatrical aspects of the crime. Fourth, the timing. Mrs. Crimmen's arrival at Mand House coincided precisely with Hale's ultimatum regarding the embezzled funds. Poirot paused in his methodical enumeration, his gaze fixed upon the defeated man who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. But perhaps most damning of all is the evidence you left behind in your hasty flight, the partnership records. Detailing your systematic theft, the correspondence proving Hale's discovery of your crimes, and the stolen money itself, hidden away in your secret compartment, like a pirate's treasure. The man's shoulders sagged in defeat. Septimus was going to destroy me, he said quietly. 20 years of partnership, and he would have sent me to prison without a second thought. So, you murdered him instead? Inspector Grimby said grimly. It was never supposed to be murder. Not at first. I thought I could convince him to stay quiet, to give me time to make restitution. But he was adamant, said his conscience wouldn't allow him to be party to a fraud, even to save an old friend. Mrs. Aldridge spoke for the first time since the proceedings began. How could you use my house for such a terrible purpose? The reputation of Mand House? We'll recover, madame, Poirot assured her gently. Indeed, I suspect the true story of this case will prove far more intriguing to your guests than any supernatural manifestations. As the constables prepared to escort their prisoner to the waiting police van, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary complexity of the crime we had unraveled. The use of the haunted room's reputation, the recruitment of an innocent, theatrical accomplice, the exploitation of supernatural beliefs, all woven together into a plot that had very nearly succeeded. One question remains, I said to Poirot as we watched the police vehicle disappear into the Yorkshire mist. How did you first suspect that Blackwood and Whitmore were the same person? My friend smiled with quiet satisfaction. It was the mustache, mon ami. The mustache? Mais oui. You see, during our initial interview with Arthur Blackwood, I observed that he possessed the faint marks of a recently shaved mustache, barely visible but unmistakable to one who appreciates such details. Yet, when Marcus Whitmore arrived from London, he bore no trace of facial hair whatsoever. I'm afraid I don't follow. A man who habitually wears a mustache, Hastings, does not shave it off lightly. But a man who must assume a false identity might well do so to alter his appearance. The absence of such marks on Whitmore's face, combined with their presence on Blackwood's, suggested they were one and the same person. The mustache shaved, off for the Blackwood disguise, then allowed to grow back for the Whitmore persona. I shook my head in admiration. Your attention to such details never ceases to amaze me, Poirot. It is the little things, mon ami, that reveal the greatest truths. The little gray cells, they notice what others overlook. And in this case, what a man chose to overlook about his own appearance nearly cost him his freedom. As we prepared to return to London the following morning, I found myself grateful once again for the privilege of witnessing Poirot's extraordinary abilities. The supernatural terrors of Mon House had given way to a very human story of greed, betrayal, and the lengths to which a desperate man would go to preserve his reputation and freedom. Thanks for joining us for The Murder in the Wardrobe. We hope this tale of elaborate schemes and calculated murder kept you captivated until the very end. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cafe Tales for more classic detective tales. Until our next mystery unfolds, this is Ailey signing off from Cafe Tales.